Okay, so Assalamu alaikum everyone. My name is Rida Shahab. I'm a third year medical student, and today I'm gonna be teaching you guys psychiatry. It's gonna be a short crash course, inshallah. We're gonna be talking about the first six lectures that you guys have taken so far. And inshallah, if you have any questions throughout the session, please feel free to reach out to my number and ask your doubts, and I'll get back to you. So let's start with our first lecture, which is Introduction to Psychiatry. Now, psychiatry is mainly there's three parts of the brain that are involved in psychiatry. Okay, now how they're divided is there's a survival state, there's an emotional state, and there's an executive state or brains. Okay, so there's a survival brain, there's an emotional brain, and there's an executive brain. Now, for the survival brain, the main part of your brain that is going to help you surviving is going to be your brainstem. Now, what do we mean by surviving? We mean breathing, your sleep cycle, your basic tasks like hunger, thirst, all of this, right? Now, then you also have your emotional brain. Now, your emotional brain is also controlled by your limbic system, okay? The limbic system itself has a lot of organs or a lot of parts of the brain that go under that category that of course we're going to talk about in the future. But for now, what you need to know is this part of the brain is going to help you mainly regulate all your emotions. Okay, now finally, then we have our executive brain or our thinking brain. The thinking brain is you're gonna have your prefrontal lobes, right? Under this, which are gonna help you basically make decisions, think, and also control or modulate your limbic system. So they're gonna help modulate your limbic system and make sure that you're not really you know, overreacting based on your emotions. So those are like the three different brains. And to keep everything simple, the survival brain is what's going to keep the organism alive and what helps them react fast. The limbic system is going to be where your emotions, your memory, your attachments all come into place, okay? And then, of course, your prefrontal cortex is where the reasoning, the planning, the decision making, everything is going to happen there. Now, what's really important to keep in mind is that psychiatry symptoms they often appear when the alarm system overpowers the brake system. Now, what do we mean by this? It's not going to really make sense right now. It's going to make sense more in the future. But just know that there's going to be basically, a misbalance of either inhibitory or excitatory organs, which is going to lead to certain psychiatric disorders. Okay. Now, we have your smart brain, which is your prefrontal cortex, your emotional brain, which is your limbic system, and then your survival brain, which is your brainstem. Okay, now let's get into the details of every single one of them, starting off with the survival brain. The survival brain is also called the lizard brain, which is a bit weird, but how you can remember this is when you look at a lizard, you want to survive from that lizard, right? So the survival brain is also called the lizard brain because technically you don't like lizards and you want to survive from them. Okay, that's how I remembered it. But yeah, the survival brain is the brain that keeps the organism alive. Now, how it does that is it's of course it's gonna help in your instinctive functions, which are gonna be your respiratory, your circadian rhythm, your hunger, your thirst, your sex drive, even flight and fight responses. All of this is controlled by your survival brain. Now, very important point is also that we share this brain with animals as well. So animals also have survival brain, okay? Because of course it's like the most basic part of the brain. Everybody has it. Okay. So it's the most basic part of the brain. We share it with animals as well. It's mainly responsible for keeping the body alive because of course you're going to be regulating your breathing, your heart rate, your blood pressure all through this specific part of the brain. Now, what's really important to know here is that it also releases dopamine, which creates a sense of reward or pleasure for you to do more of something that's helping you release dopamine. Okay, so that's the survival brain, which is the brainstem. Okay, now let's move on to the limbic system, which is the emotional brain. Now, the limbic system, as we talked about, it's responsible for emotions, memory, motivation, and most importantly, sleep as well. So it's going to play a major role in forming emotional connections and attachment. Now, the clinical importance of the limbic brain is that the mothers are more attached with their babies because they have a bigger limbic system, and of course, the baby is growing inside them. So their limbic brain just just, makes that emotional bonding and attachment with the baby. Okay, now we talked about how there's main structures under the limbic system, the umbrella of the limbic system. What are those four structures? These are really important to know. So we have our amygdala, we have our hippocampus, hypothalamus, and basal ganglia. Okay, now amygdala is really important. As soon as you see the word fear or threat, the first thing that should come to your mind is amygdala, because that's what actually is gonna bring in the first response to fear or threat. Okay, then you have hippocampus. Hippocampus is what's connected to amygdala, and it's also important for memory formation. So all the memories that are forming are being formed in the hippocampus. Okay, then we have the hypothalamus. Hypothalamus is more of the regulatory part of the brain, right? So it's going to regulate drives, it's going to regulate hormones, your circadian rhythm. All of that is also going to be regulated by hypothalamus. And then we have the basal ganglia. The basal ganglia is involved in movements, behavior, and motivation. Now, one thing I want you to keep in mind is that there's a lot of parts of the brains that overlap each other. So we did talk about survival part of the brain, and we said that it also helps improving sleep, but then the limbic system also does that. That's only because every part of the brain is kind of interconnected with each other. So the limbic system, how does that control sleep cycle is when you have, let's say, like you do not see your friend for too often, right? They're very far away from you and you go into depression, so your sleep cycle kind of gets dysregulated because of the limbic system. So there's overlap of certain parts of the brain in controlling different systems, which is really important to know. So don't get confused. Um, yeah, that's pretty much all that I had to say. Now let's zoom in on this picture. Let's see the locations of our limbic system, right? So our limbic system is completely located in this part of our brain. Now, this here is the amygdala. Amygdala is the first thing that should come to your mind when you're talking about fear or threat. Connected to the amygdala, or right beside amygdala, in a better word, is hippocampus. Hippocampus is where your memories formations are going to take place. Okay, and then you have your hypothalamus. Hypothalamus is just the regulatory part of the brain, which is going to regulate breathing, not tachycardia, sorry, heart rate, blood pressure, all of that. And then you have your basal ganglia. Basal ganglia is what's going to bring in the movements. Okay, so this entirely is what your limbic system is. You also have the cingulate gyrus, but it was not really discussed in your lectures, so don't focus on it for now. Focus on it from the perspective of anatomy, yes. Okay. So let's talk about the main part of our brain, which is the thinking brain. It's also the most advanced part of our brain. And what we mean by thinking brain is your prefrontal cortex. Okay, now it's responsible for reasoning, judgment, planning, and decision making. So it's going to allow you to basically take decisions. And whenever you're studying something hard, let's say maths, pharma, all of that, these are higher intellectual tasks where your prefrontal cortex is actually involved in learning. Okay, now, it's also the last part to mature fully, and it takes up about 25 years for humans to develop their prefrontal cortex, which is why people say that as you're growing older, you learn how to make your decisions more smartly, right? Because you're not going to let a 17-year-old make a decision for you because their prefrontal cortex is not really developed, right? So as you're growing older, your judgment, your insights, everything improves because your prefrontal cortex is growing. Okay, this is just a picture summarizing the limbic system. We already covered this. Now let's go into the details again. Now we're going to specifically be talking about amygdala from the different parts of the limbic system. So we have amygdala, we have hippocampus, hypothalamus, and basal ganglia. So how you can remember that is you can just remember it as HAB, but there's double H. So hippocampus, hypothalamus, amygdala, and basal ganglia is what constitutes the limbic system in total. So amygdala comes from the Greek word almond, and it's also kind of shaped like an almond, which is why they call it amygdala. Now it's located in the temporal lobes, which is the part of the limbic system. I don't know how important it is to know your anatomical locations from the psychiatric point of view, but it's better to always know them. So just know that it's located in the temporal lobes. Now the functions of the amygdala is really important. As we discussed, we said that it detects threat and alarm. And basically alarms you if you're safe or not. So anything that could potentially cause fear, the first reaction always comes from amygdala. It's really important to know that. And how does it do that? It does that to the HPA axis, okay? So you see the fear, the amygdala is gonna activate the HPA axis, okay? Now, It's also gonna process your emotions because, of course, it's a part of the limbic system. There's also going to be emotion learning and conditioning through the amygdala. Now, what's really important to keep in mind is that amygdala and prefrontal cortex always work hand in hand. So if amygdala is looking at something as a fear, the prefrontal cortex is going to come and it's going to be like, "Hey, amygdala, you're overreacting. This is just a rope. It's not a snake." So if the amygdala looks at a fear and activates the HPA axis, the prefrontal cortex is actually going to put things into perspective and tell the amygdala that you're thinking too much. This is not what you think it is. This is just harmless rope. Okay? Okay. Now, now let's talk about what actually happens when the amygdala is not functioning well. What psychiatric disorders does it actually bring up? So if amygdala is hyperactive, that means every small thing that you're looking at is causing some sort of fear in your mind. Of course, it's going to lead to anxiety. It's going to lead to PTSD, right? Which is post-traumatic disorder. Now, if there is hyperactive amygdala, it's always going to be there. It's always going to have exaggerated fear. There's going to be panic attacks. There's going to be persistent fear memories as well. Okay, and then you also have depression, which is again, there's going to be abnormal connectivity between the amygdala and the prefrontal cortex. So because the prefrontal cortex is not, it's not really, it cannot really babysit the amygdala anymore. The amygdala is not listening to the prefrontal cortex. What's going to happen is that it's going to perceive every little thing as negative and think of it as a negative, like a negative emotion, which is what's going to cause depression or anxiety. There's also autism spectrum disorder, which causes basically difference in amygdala volume and development. So the amygdala is not going to be really developed, which is why there's going to be problems in socially interacting with patients that have autism, and also there's going to be eye contact difficulties. They can't really process their emotions because their amygdala is not really developed. There's also schizophrenia, which is blunted amygdala activity. They're going to have blunted amygdala activity. So they can also not really control their emotions. Not really control, yani they don't really even have emotions. They have reduced emotions to begin with. So they're kind of like, they can't really express their emotions because they're reduced emotions. Okay, now this is what I just mentioned. We said that when anxiety and depression is there, that means the amygdala is not really listening to the prefrontal cortex. So the prefrontal cortex cannot control the amygdala anymore. Okay, now everything starts from the childhood, which is really important to know. Okay, so if let's say the amygdala is dysfunctioning, that means that it has something to do with the childhood, right? So from the moment you're born, your brain starts developing. Everybody knows that. And the most important part of the brain is the amygdala because it causes fear, not causes fear, gives you the emotional attachment, the emotional understanding, right? So if you had a good childhood, if you had a stable childhood, then you're going to have more balanced view of things, more balanced way of actually perceiving your emotions, right? But if your childhood was not that good, if it had traumas of any sort, then your amygdala is always going to be on the edge. It's always going to be on its toes, thinking of every little thing as a fear or as a threat, right? Now that's just the processing of amygdala. Again, we discovered this, we covered this as well. We talked about how prefrontal cortex is actually the babysitter of amygdala. Okay, how does it actually babysit? Because when the baby is crying, you give it milk, right? And it stops crying. What do you actually give amygdala? How are you going to calm it down? What you give amygdala is you give it inhibitory signals. And by inhibitory signals, we mean GABA. Okay, we send inhibitory signals to the amygdala to tell it to calm down because it's perceiving a rope as a snake, which is not a threat. Okay, so this is an example. We said that amygdala looks at a rope, it thinks it's a snake. So that's the first initial reaction. It causes fear in the person's body. The prefrontal cortex then comes into play and it sends inhibitory signals to the amygdala, which is going to be your GABA. And then it tells amygdala that, hey, look, this is a rope, it's not a snake. You're overreacting or you're thinking of it in a wrong way. Okay, now amygdala actually has two different processes, right? Now we're gonna talk about the fight or flight process, and then we're gonna talk about the memory. Now, for the fight or flight, when it actually looks at a threat and it's like, oh, like this is something that can cause harm to me. right? It detects threat like snake, lion, whatever, right? It's going to signal the hypothalamus. It's going to signal the hypothalamus, which is going to activate the HPA axis, as we mentioned before. What does the HPA axis stand for? Hypothalamus, pituitary, adrenal axis. Okay, so the hypothalamus gets activated, and then it's going to activate the pituitary and the adrenal, which is going to activate the sympathetic nervous system. And when the sympathetic nervous system is activated, that means you're in the fight mode, right? You're going to be sweating, your pupils are going to be dilated, you're going to be tachycardic, right? So that's what the sympathetic nervous system does. And then the adrenal gland, as well as locus coeruleus, really important, they're going to release norepinephrine. What's norepinephrine? Norepinephrine is technically a brother of cortisol. So it's kind of like a stress hormone, right? So it's gonna cause stress. What happens is there's going to be tachycardia, there's going to be sweating, there's going to be hyperalertness, and it's also going to shut down your logical frontal lobe. Okay, just to put things in perspective, you look at a threat, amygdala looks at a threat, and it says that, okay, this is harmful for me. It's going to activate the HPA axis. The HPA axis is going to activate the hypothalamus, which is going to activate pituitary and adrenal. And adrenal is going to release norepinephrine, which is basically going to stimulate the sympathetic nervous system, which is going to cause tachycardia, sweating, and hyperalertness. That's what happens. What's really important to keep in mind is this HPA axis is only activated for short term. So if it's activated for a long term, that could be dangerous for us, right? Okay, let's leave it there because we're going to come back to it later. Okay, now we talked about the first process, which was the HPA axis. When we look at a threat, that's what gets activated. For the memory activation, this is when a patient for your lecture, there was a patient, I don't really remember her name. The case was more about a patient that saw a jacket and then she started having a panic attack. Now, why did that happen? Is because this jacket was a trigger for a traumatic memory that she had in her childhood, where her mother tried to, put on her jacket very roughly on her, so it kind of like hurt her. So it was kind of like a trigger, right? So when a person does see a trigger that could trigger their brain, the adrenal gland is going to secrete norepinephrine, and this norepinephrine is now going to go activate amygdala. Okay, so here the process is quite opposite from what's happening in the HPA axis, right? So the trigger is going to activate adrenal gland, which is going to release norepinephrine. The norepinephrine is going to go activate amygdala. The amygdala is then going to activate or signal your locus coeruleus to release more norepinephrine. And if there's more norepinephrine being released, what's going to happen is it's going to activate hippocampus. And what did we say hippocampus does? It's going to store memories. So it's going to have that traumatic memory stored in there. And when that's going to get activated, it's going to basically release that memory. And the patient is going to re experience the entire traumatic period that they had with that jacket. Um, so they're going to have that panic attack. Okay. So those are the two different axes or two different ways amygdala does its function. So there's the HPA axis, which is for the fear. And then for the memory activation, it starts from the adrenal gland, which is going to activate amygdala. And then the amygdala activates the LC, which is locus coeruleus. And then it's going to activate the hippocampus, which is going to bring the memory back. Okay, as we're on memories, why is it so hard to forget the memory of a loved one? Now, it's really hard to forget the memory of a loved one because they have thicker dendrites in our brain. So they also have dopaminergic neurons in the nucleus accumbens. Accumbens. Okay. Now it's going to basically develop longer, thicker dendrites, and there's going to be stronger neural connections. So let's say if a loved one is living too far away from you and you cannot really see them, right? These dopaminergic neurons, or let's say you had a breakup with them, you're not with them anymore, right? Let's not make them pass away. Let's just say that you kind of had a breakup with them, okay? Okay. Now, because you and that person are not talking anymore, and these neurons were actually dopaminergic, that means you're not going to have more of dopamine anymore, right? There's not going to be release of dopamine anymore, which is what's going to cause depression. So, which is what happens when there's actually a detachment of a person that you like a lot or you love a lot. When they're detached from you, these dopaminergic neurons in the nucleus accumbens, they have thicker dendrites, which is why it's really hard to forget them. But because they're not around you anymore, these dopaminergic neurons are not even going to release dopamine, which is going to cause depression, which is what's going to cause the sadness, like the what's the word? I don't know the word, but basically the sadness and the gloominess, right? Of not having that person around. Okay. Now let's talk about the thinking part of our brain. So we talked about the limbic system. Now let's talk about the thinking part of our brain. Okay, for the thinking part of our brain, we're going to be focusing on the prefrontal cortex. The prefrontal cortex is divided into two different parts. So there is the dorsolateral and then there's the orbitofrontal cortex. For now, we're going to be focusing on the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. Their location is the lateral frontal lobes. For the limbic system, it was the temporal lobes. Remember that. And for the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, the main functions here are memory, no, sorry, working memory, planning and organization, and also cognitive flexibility. Okay, for dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, it's quite obvious because if there's underactivity of the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, then there's going to be low motivation, there's going to be slow thinking, indecisiveness, and poor concentration. Okay, but if there's overactivity of the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, then there's going to be anxiety, there's going to be irritability, and also excessive worrying. So the dysfunction of prefrontal cortex is strongly involved with major depression and ADHD. And it's also the CEO for initiating actions and following through on plans, which we're going to discuss. Okay, we're going to discuss them right here. So, the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex is actually going to generate the intention to do something. So, for example, you want to walk till your door. That's the intention that your dorsolateral prefrontal cortex is going to induce, right? The basal ganglia is what's going to actually do the action plan. So, it's what actually makes you move or makes you do that movement, basically. Now, if there's a low dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, if it's not really working well, and then there's a weak basal ganglia drive, that means that the patient cannot really convert that intention into action, right? Now, this difficulty of converting that intention into action is abulia, which is basically just you not being able to do that action that you kind of intended to do. Okay, so it's just seen as mental fatigue, difficulty starting tasks, and also feeling stuck because technically your dorsolateral prefrontal cortex is not working, okay, or it has reduced functions. Now, for the orbitofrontal cortex, so we talked about the dorsolateral frontal cortex, now we're going to talk about the orbitofrontal cortex. Okay, for the orbitofrontal cortex, the core functions here are it's also located in the frontal lobe, but in the ventral side of the frontal lobe, just above the orbits, okay? Just above your eye orbits. Now, the key role here is it's for reward evaluation and decision making. And there's also, it basically just chooses long-term rewards over short-term impulses when it's functioning well. So it's going to give you that satisfaction of you doing well when you're doing your tasks, okay? And it also integrates emotional and social information into decisions. What's really important about orbitofrontal cortex is that it's going to modulate amygdala responses. Now, what do we mean by this? We mean that it's actually going to, you know how we said that the prefrontal cortex is the babysitter for the limbic system? Yes, it is. But more specifically, what part of the prefrontal cortex is going to modulate the limbic system? It's going to be the orbitofrontal cortex, right? So the orbitofrontal cortex is the one that's going to send the inhibitory signals to the limbic system to tell it that it's overreacting or it's not even a threat, and it also like maintains that emotional stability and that appropriate behavior, right? So if there is damage to the orbitofrontal cortex, that means that your amygdala is taking place, right? Your amygdala is on the front line now because the orbitofrontal cortex cannot really protect it anymore or is not there to protect it. That means the patient's going to present with impulsivity, right? Their emotions are going to take over. There's going to be poor judgment. There's going to be emotional liability, all because the orbitofrontal cortex is dysfunction or is damaged. So it's really important in addiction, bipolar disorder, depression, ADHD, and borderline personality disorder. And what's really important to also keep in mind is that orbitofrontal cortex is really vulnerable to head injuries, right? So the collisions or falls, if a patient presents after a road accident or after a car accident with a change in their personality, the most common differential that you should keep in mind is a damage to the orbitofrontal cortex, right? Because it's more vulnerable to head injuries and also they're going to have changes in their behaviors. Oops, sorry, changes in their behaviors, emotional liability, and all of that. Now, as we discussed earlier, everything starts from the childhood. So for the limbic system and for the thinking system too, everything is going to start from the childhood. So for the orbitofrontal cortex, because it's going to give you that emotional maturity, like that emotional intelligence in general, if your childhood or if your attachment with your mother or your caregiver was stable, then you're going to have a stronger top-down inhibitory control over your emotions from the orbitofrontal cortex, right? But if you had a very poor or an unstable attachment with your caregiver or your mother, then you're going to have a weaker regulation of the orbitofrontal cortex, and you're going to have more of amygdala driven activity, which means you're going to be relying more on your emotions rather than on your critical thinking. Now, we talked about this. We said that the amygdala works through the HPA axis, correct? Now, what's important to know here is we said that the HPA axis is activated short term, right? But if there's chronic activation of the HPA axis, it could lead to persistent anxiety, insomnia, and somatic stress. Why? Because we said that the norepinephrine and the cortisol eventually are going to rise up too high, and they're just going to keep giving you anxiety, and it's really harmful for the patient in general. Now, let's talk about hippocampus. So we talked about the limbic system, right? We talked about amygdala and we talked about basal ganglia. Now we're going to talk about the hippocampus and the hypothalamus. We also talked about the thinking part of the brain, which is your prefrontal cortex. Okay. For the hippocampus, we talked about the core functions. We said that the hippocampus is the one that's going to store all the memories. So all the memory formation and consolidation is going to happen in the hippocampus. It's going to convert the short-term memories into long-term memories, and it also supports spatial navigation and contextual memory. So basically, where you are, what you're doing, when is this going to happen, when is that going to happen, all of this is hippocampus, and it's also essential for learning newer information. So right now, if you're watching this and you're learning all of this and you're trying to retain information, your hippocampus is working to retain all these memories in your brain so you can remember it in the exam. Okay, now hippocampus is also rich in glucocorticoid receptors, which are your cortisol receptors. So if there is chronic stress, right, and there is elevated cortisol, it's actually gonna affect your hippocampus because it also has the receptors for cortisol. And what it's gonna do is it's gonna make your hippocampus shrink. So there's gonna be a hippocampal atrophy, which is volume loss, technically. And when there is loss of this hippocampus volume, what is going to happen? Because it stores memories, now there's going to be impaired memory. So it's going to be basically short-term memory for people that have a hippocampal atrophy. There's going to be difficulty modulating the HPA axis and also cognitive symptoms of depression in general. So if the patient does present with depression, you need to treat it ASAP so that their hippocampus doesn't get atrophied. Okay, now in your lectures, this picture was there, and I think it's really important to kind of make it make sense. So the normal hippocampus is going to have all these organized neurons. There's going to be all, like good ventricles. It looks pretty good. But when you compare it with schizophrenia patients, there's going to be reduced volume. You can see how the volume has been reduced. There's also disorganized neurons, enlarged ventricles, which is why the schizophrenic patients, they're not going to be able to consolidate any information or take any information because their memory is impaired because of damage to the hippocampus. Okay, so that's hippocampus done. Now let's go to hypothalamus. We talked about hypothalamus. We said hypothalamus is the regulatory organ, right? So it's going to regulate all like your respiratory stuff, your basic stuff like thirst, sexual drive, hunger, all of this. Okay, now it's going to link the nervous system to the endocrine system via the pituitary, which is the HPA axis. Okay, now it maintains homeostasis. It's going to maintain your temperature, your hunger, your circadian rhythm, which is your sleep cycle, all of it. It's really important. Now, what's really important to keep in mind is that it's a key regulator of the HPA axis. So what happens is that there's the HPA axis. How does it actually work? Is of course it's going to release norepinephrine to the adrenal gland and the locus coeruleus, but it gets more deeper than that. It's going to release cortisol releasing hormone from the adrenal gland, which is going to release ACTH, which is going to release cortisol as well. Now, this cortisol is gonna, if it's persistently high, it's gonna lead to anxiety. Okay. Now, hypothalamus also controls the sympathetic, which is your fight, and parasympathetic, which is your flight mode, right? So, sympathetic and parasympathetic is also controlled by hypothalamus. So, basically, hypothalamus is like the key controller of everything: your circadian rhythm, your thirst, your hunger, your fight flight mode, literally everything that you can think of, hypothalamus controls that. Now, if the hypothalamus is not functioning well, if it has a dysfunction, what happens? Because it has that dysfunction, now there's going to be high levels of cortisol, right? Because it's a key regulator of the HPA axis. And because of this disrupted balance, there's going to be abnormal heart rate, blood pressure, sweating, temperature regulation, all because it also controls sympathetic and parasympathetic things, right? So there's also going to be appetite and weight changes, sleep wake disruption because it also controls circadian rhythm. So this is what actually contributes to the different symptoms of psychiatric illnesses. Okay, so now we talked about the different parts of the brain. We talked about the survival brain, which is the lizard brain. We talked about the limbic system, and then we talked about the thinking brain. So I hope that's clear because now we're going to jump on to the three main brain networks. Now, what are the three main brain networks? So in psychiatry, you have the default mode network, you have the central executive network, and the salience network. Okay, the balance and the switching between these networks is really important for your basically for your healthy emotions and your cognition in general. Let's start with the default mode network. Okay. You have a default mode network. This is just a picture that summarizes all the, oh, oops, sorry. This is just a picture that summarizes all three of this together. We're going to be using it as well. The default mode network basically is active during rest, daydreaming, and internal focus. So when you're not actually doing anything, your default mode network is activated. It's like the default mode, right? Now the functions are just imagining the future, mind wandering, all of like this activity that you're doing while you're sitting down, not really putting your brain into work, is what comes under default mode network. Now, if there's excess activity of DMN, which is your default mode network, what's going to happen? It's going to lead you to overthink. It's going to lead you to have rumination, preoccupation, right? And it's also implicated in depression and anxiety. So if you see patients that have depression or that have anxiety, these patients tend to have a sort of like overthinking. They tend to overthink a lot of things. They tend to have those rumination periods and also periods where they talk to themselves. All of this is when the default mode network is hyperactivated than it's actually supposed to be. Okay. Then you have your central executive network. From the name, it's what's gonna be helping you do your tasks. So your cognitive tasks or your focused attention tasks are what helps this brain, or basically what this brain helps do. Okay, so it's gonna basically help in problem solving, decision making, and also goal directed behavior. And it also relies heavily on your dorsolateral prefrontal cortex and parietal regions. Makes sense because your prefrontal cortex also helps in problem solving and decision making. So your central executive network heavily relies on the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. And if there is underactivity or poor engagement, there's going to be difficulty concentrating, planning, and organizing because, of course, you cannot really make your decision anymore because it's underactive, right? The salience network is the middleman, okay? It's the one that actually switches between the default mode network and the central executive network. So if you want to go from if you're sitting and you're like, okay, I want to study. So you're going to be shifting from a default mode network to your central executive network. This is where the salience network comes in and actually helps you switch. So if there is dysfunction of your salience network, then there's going to be poor switching. So you're going to be stuck in the default mode network where you're going to be overthinking, you're going to be in your mind, you're not really going to have that good concentration on your studies, or you're not going to be, just you're not going to be able to do your tasks properly because you're stuck in the default mode network. Now, let's move on to defense mechanisms, which is the last part of our lecture. Now, defense mechanisms are basically the unconscious psychological strategies that protects the ego from anxiety and conflict, right? Now, sometimes these can be adaptive or maladaptive. So there's mature defenses, there's immature defenses, and it's really important to recognize the patterns and then talk to these patients rather than just labeling the patients as something else. Okay. Let's start with the mature defenses. So you have sublimation. Sublimation is when you're gonna challenge, you're gonna basically channel unacceptable impulses into socially acceptable activities. So, for example, when you're stressed and you don't really want to think about the stress, you actually just channel the stress and start working or start swimming to take it off. So this is sublimation, okay? Suppression is when you're consciously postponing attention to a distressing thought or feeling. So you're suppressing it. You're like, okay, consciously, I don't want to think about this right now, right? So you're postponing your attention from that topic. Then there's humor. Humor is when you're expressing like uncomfortable feelings in a way that is acceptable and can relieve tension. So you have a trauma, but you're finding humor in that trauma, and that's how you're relieving tension. Okay, so that's humor. And then there's altruism. Altruism is when you're dealing with one's own conflicts by helping others. So if you're dealing with something, you start helping others out, and then you feel better about yourself. That's altruism. Okay, so there's sublimation, which is when you're channeling, like the stress somewhere else. Then there's suppression, which is where you're consciously postponing your attention to a topic that really doesn't cause you stress. Then there's humor, and then there's altruism. Those are mature defenses. Then there's neurotic or intermediate defenses. Now, what's the difference between mature, neurotic, and immature defenses is that mature defenses are usually by its name. It's defenses that the adults usually have. For neurotic, it's usually what the teenagers have. For the immature ones, it's like okay, like people that do not really have their brain developed really well, they can have immature defenses. That's what it basically means, okay? For the neurotic or intermediate defenses, there's repression. Repression is when you're unconsciously keeping disturbing thoughts out of awareness. So repression is unconsciously. Suppression is consciously. That's the difference between them, okay? Then displacement is where you're shifting emotions from a threatening target to a safer one. Okay, just displacing your thoughts, okay, from a threatful thing to a safer location. Then you have reaction formation. Reaction formation is when you're transforming unacceptable impulse into its opposite. So you're being overly kind when you're angry. That's reaction formation. So you're doing quite the opposite of what you're supposed to do. Then there's intellectualization, which is focusing on facts and logic to avoid emotional distress. And then there's rationalization. So you're basically rationalizing whatever you want to do to appear reasonable and acceptable to self and others. So if you want to eat a chocolate, you're kind of like rationalizing yourself to appear reasonable and acceptable. Then you have immature defenses, which are your denial. So you're not ready to accept anything. You're just denying everything. There's projection, which is you're attributing one's own unacceptable thoughts or feelings to others. So you're projecting your opinions on someone else. Okay. There's also splitting. Splitting is when you view people as either they're really nice or they're really bad. Like there's no in between. There's okay, this person's really bad or this person's really good. That's splitting. Then acting out is when you're acting out and you're expressing these unconscious feelings through actions rather than words. You're screaming or whatever. Okay. Then finally, you have psychodynamic phenomena. Now, this has two defenses. There's transference and countertransference. Transference is when the patient unconsciously redirects their feelings from an important person onto the doctor. Okay. It's going to make more sense when you do questions. And then there's countertransference, which is when the doctor unconsciously projects their own feelings onto the patients. So when the doctor does it, it's countertransference. But when the patient does it, it's transference. Okay? Now, these defense mechanisms are really important for the exam. When I say really important, I mean like a five-star importance. So you need to know these. You need to do more and more questions to be understanding of what exactly are these, but they're really easy to understand. So remember, suppression is conscious, repression is unconscious. There's also reaction formation, which is what you do something that you're not supposed to, like you're doing the opposite of what you're supposed to do, right? Reaction formation is really important. Suppression, repression, the immature ones are really easy to remember. Then the psychodynamic phenomena are also really important. Transference is when the patient projects their emotions onto the doctor from an important person, like they shift their emotions from that person to the doctor. The countertransference is when the doctor does it. This is also unconsciously, they're not doing it consciously. Okay, with that, our first lecture finally comes to an end, and now we're going to be doing questions. So let's start. Ahmed is a psychiatrist, okay, who feels annoyed with his aggressive patient. Later on, when he thought about it, he realized the patient reminded him of his ex-wife. What defense mechanism is the psychiatrist demonstrating? Gonna give you guys 5 seconds. Okay, so when the doctor does it, it's countertransference, okay? So it's countertransference, defense mechanism. If the patient did it, if the patient is mad at the doctor just because they're mad at their husband or something, that's transference, okay? Okay, the second question is a patient has a panic attack out of nowhere. After a certain cue, this may reflect what? Which one of these options do you think is going to be the right answer? Okay, so the right answer here is B because it's implicitting memory triggering from amygdala. So that panic attack that came out of nowhere after a certain cue was because there was a trigger that implicit the memory, the traumatic memory. Okay, a person who acts on immediate desires without considering consequences likely has a dysfunction in the. Okay, so the answer here is orbitofrontal cortex. Really, really easy, right? Because if you're acting on your immediate desires, which means you're acting directly on your emotions, that means your amygdala is working. That's the first in line. And your frontal cortex, prefrontal cortex, is not there anymore. And what part of prefrontal cortex specifically helps modulate amygdala? It's the orbitofrontal cortex. So if there was a prefrontal cortex and orbitofrontal cortex, you can choose orbitofrontal cortex, even though it's not going to be there. It's either going to be orbitofrontal cortex or prefrontal cortex. Okay, now let's move on to our second lecture, which is psychiatric interviews. This one's a really easy lecture, and it's really basic understanding, so we're gonna be done with it fast. Now, what are the goals of the psychiatric interview? It's understanding what the patient thinks, feels, and does. So you're not just looking at their symptoms, but you're actually there to listen to the patient, and you're explaining both. You're basically exploring both what is said and how it is said. So, how the patient is expressing themselves and what they're saying is really important to keep in mind. So, basically, building a safe, trusting relationship. The goals are really we talked about the goals, but the process is really really important to know. So first you can of course introduce yourself with your name and role. You can greet the patient by name, exactly how you basically do your HPI process. You're going to ensure privacy, you're going to sit down, you're not going to have a judgmental attitude at all. You have to be open-minded when you're listening to your patients. And from the start, what you're going to do is you're going to observe the patient. You're going to look at their posture, you're going to look at their eye contact, you're going to look at their general appearance as well, because that says a lot about our patients. Then you're going to always begin with open-ended questions. You're never going to give them close-ended questions or yes or no questions or why questions. Never. You're going to always give them broad questions where they have the ground for themselves to talk about whatever they're feeling, right? So you're going to be telling them, "Hey, how have you been feeling lately?" So they have this entire ground where they can say anything to tell you how they actually feel, right? And you're gonna basically just tell them, hey, tell me what brought you here today. How are you feeling? Not why are you feeling this? No, you're not gonna do any of that because that's gonna shut things down, and they're gonna feel like you're kind of like pressuring them. So that's why. So you're gonna use close-ended questions later on when you actually wanna narrow down what exactly is happening. That's when you're gonna use close-ended questions, not at the start. At the start, you're always gonna use open-ended questions. And then of course, whenever you're talking to the patient and they're like, I'm sad or I'm anxious, you're going to pause and then you're going to explore what's actually happening. So you're going to be like, okay, what makes this worse, right? What makes this better? How long has this been going on? So everything off like HBI, basically, you're just going to be exploring more of their symptoms. And a really important question that you need to ask psychiatric patients is when was the last time they felt okay? Because that can actually give you a very good diagnosis because there's different disorders that last for like a different period of time, right? So you need to ask them about that. And you're going to also always ask about the impact of their work, their study. So if they're a medicine student, you're going to ask them how their studies are impacting their daily life. If they're working, you're going to ask them, okay, your 9 to 5 job, how is it really impacting your life? So you ask them about basically everything. Um, then you're going to identify the content of the patient. patients, what the patient is presenting with. So you're going to see if there's basically any themes of pause, rejection, if they have any guilt, if they have any stress, all of that. And also the process. So how are they, like how are they saying stuff? How is their understanding of this information or of this, like of this thing that they're going through? Are they emotional about it? What is their comfort level talking about this? Their reaction to questions? All of this is really important to also know. So you're always going to cover presenting complaint and HPI, right? You're going to introduce yourself. You're going to make sure that the patient is safe, everything is safe around them, and then you're going to talk to them, give them open-ended questions. You're going to basically ask them the last time they felt okay, really important. You're going to ask them different sorts of questions that we learned already in HPI. You're going to also discover or explore their past psychiatric and medical history and medications. Really, really important because medications can cause psychiatric symptoms, right? So you need to explore what medications they're taking. Maybe it's because of the medications. You're going to talk about family history. You're going to talk about social history. You're going to also talk about their childhood history because, of course, everything comes from childhood. Really important to talk about this is when you're talking with your patient, right? You need to ask about them, ask about suicides and drug alcohol use and self-harm. These things are really important to be asked about, especially in psychiatric patients. So you need to ask them about their suicidal ideations, if they have any ideas about it, have they've been thinking about this for a long time, their plans, their means, all of that. Then also the self-harm and their alcohol and drug use. Okay, then you also have to screen them for mania and hypomania. So you're gonna look for less sleep, more energy, spending, risk taking, all of this. It's gonna make more sense when we take mood disorders, but just know that you're also gonna screen for mania and hypomania in these patients. You're also gonna be exploring their trauma and childhood gently. So you're not gonna be too rough with them. You're gonna give them the space and time to talk about everything. You're gonna talk about their relationships with parents because sometimes it can be too shaky and they don't really want to talk about it. So you give them time. You be compassionate with them, okay? Be observant with them, listen to them, okay? So move at the patient's pace. Now, for the interview techniques, this is really important. So there's certain interview techniques, like we had defense mechanisms in the first lecture. In the second lecture, we have interview techniques that we're going to be talking about. For example, there's reflection. Now, what is reflection? Reflection is when you're paraphrasing emotions or feelings to show understanding. So when they're talking, you can be like, "Oh, it sounds like you feel very lonely in this. I'm so sorry to hear about this." Right? So you're gonna do these interview techniques to show the patient that you care. There's also facilitation, which is you're going to be nodding, you're going to be, like leaning forward to hear them, and as they're talking, and be like, go on. So it actually says or it tells the patient that you're listening, okay? There's also silence. So you're gonna give them the space to think, to feel, to cry. You're not gonna really push them into a corner on feeling anything, right? It's their right to feel whatever they're feeling. So you're gonna give them that time and space to validate their feelings. There's also clarification. So you're gonna ask them more about, whatever they were talking about. So you're gonna be like, can you tell me more about when this happened? Can you tell me more about what you mean by this? All of this. So there's reflection, facilitation, silence, and clarification. And then there's also interpretation. Now, what does interpretation here mean? Interpretation basically means here is that, let's say the patient basically tells you that I keep pushing people away even though I don't want to be alone. Okay? So you're going to interpret it later on as it sounds like you might be afraid of getting hurt, which is why you keep pushing people away, right? So you're interpreting it to basically narrow down whatever the patient's feeling. There's also confrontation. So you're going to respectfully point out discrepancies or minimization when it's important for safety. So whenever a patient is kind of like contradicting themselves, you can always confront them, but of course, very respectfully and ask them to, basically tell you whatever is happening in the right way. There's also validation. So, of course, you're going to acknowledge their feelings as understandable in their context. Okay. Then there's bridging. Bridging is basically you move from like the emotion to the clinical detail. So, if they say that they lost their mother recently, you're going to be like, that's really unfortunate. I'm so sorry about that. But losing your mother is huge, and sometimes that can affect your sleep. So, how are your nights? So, you're going to basically bridge from one thing to the other and going to talk about, hey, how are your nights? How is your sleeping schedule going on with all of that? So those are the core interview techniques. Now, another thing is psychiatric patients, sometimes their answers are really vague. So they don't really want to talk about anything, right? So they're like, oh yeah, like they're giving like one word answers. That's when you actually shift to descriptive prompts. We're gonna actually talk to them and be like, hey, okay, walk me through your typical day. Walk me through what you actually do in your day. How do you do this? How do you do that? Like you're gonna basically talk to them and make that environment comfortable for them to, start talking. And if they deflect, if they're like, hey, ask my wife, or, you can ask my daughter this, then you're actually not going to ask their daughter or ask their wife. You're not going to do that, but you're actually going to redirect to view that relationship. So you're going to be like, oh, you have been talking about your wife a lot. How's your relationship with your wife? Are you guys close? How long have you been married? So all of that is how you're going to explore their relationship or view their relationship. And of course, you're also going to be observing the patients all the time. So you're going to be looking at their appearance, their behavior, how they're sitting, are they agitated, are they stressed? How do they look in general? And also their facial expression, because that's really important. And their speech. Are they talking too fast? How's their fluency? Are they not talking? All of that. Now, there's also mental states examination, which is you guys are going to take this in pro. You might have already taken it in pro, but this is very briefly mentioned in your lecture. I don't think you really need to know it. Mostly from the perspective of pro department, yes. But basically, you give this examination to the patient, and then you're going to make them do these tasks, and then you're going to grade them out of 30, and every grade is going to basically tell you something about their cognitive skills. Okay, then you have the Johari window and professional boundaries. So, what is the Johari window? Johari window, let's concentrate here. Okay, this might be a little bit blurry because I took screenshots from the slides, but what is the Johari window? The Johari window is just this psychological tool, right, that helps psychiatrists understand the relationship with the patients. So there's four things. So there's open area, which is and the others know too. So let's say, for example, you're the patient, okay? So the open area is what you know about yourself and what the others know about yourself too, okay? Then there's the hidden area, which is what you know about yourself, but no one else knows about that. Then there's blind spot. This is really important, which is what you don't know about yourself, but others know, others observe. And then there's the unknown area, which is where psychiatrist comes in and actually explore this area. Wait 1 second. Yeah, explores this area, right? So this is where the psychiatrists play a big role. And because you don't know and others also don't know, a third party comes in and actually observes and looks at it. So that's basically what the Johari window is. And it's not really that important, but if you understand like the gist of it, you're gonna be good. Then also, really important is professional boundaries. You're going to maintain clear professional boundaries with your patients. So there's going to be no socializing. You're not going to be talking to them after working hours. There's no romantic involvement, no gift giving, nothing, nothing, nothing at all. Your relationships with your patients should stay professional and you should recognize them as your patients. Yani don't look at them in an unprofessional way. Okay? Because of course these psychiatric patients, they usually are vulnerable, so they can depend on you a lot, and then that could just like go to a different way, which is why you need to make sure that you're always keeping professional boundaries. And then we have the four P's. The four P's are really important in psychiatric interviews. We have predisposing, we have precipitating, protective, and perpetuating. Okay, now what is this? Let's start with predisposing, okay? So predisposing is family history or stressful job. Let's take depression as an example. Okay, so if your mother was depressed, for example, that means you have a family history of depression, correct? That means the patient is also predisposed to having depression, okay? Okay, now then let's talk about precipitating. So that's predisposing done. Precipitating is basically recent trauma loss or death of a loved one. Now, this means that the patient had a lot of trauma and stress that led them to depression. Okay, so we're talking about depression, which is a major cause. Now, there's predisposing factor, which is the family history, precipitating, which is they lost someone and which led to the depression, and then there's protective. Protective is something, let's say, protective in a mechanism, yani the patient has good money, they have a good job, they have a good relationship with people, so that's a protective mechanism of them not having depression. But if this protective system is lost, that could lead them to depression. Okay, and then there's the last thing is perpetuating. Perpetuating is for example, being unemployed, you do not have a job, you do not have money. So this is leading you to depression. Okay, so these are the four P's. So there's predisposing, which is, for example, family history. There's precipitating, which is when you lose someone, right? It could lead to depression. There's protective, which is where you have a good job, you have a good relationship with your family, which is protecting you from getting depression. Because depression is the example that we're talking about here. Then there's perpetuating, which is you have financial instability, you're unemployed, you have a chronic disease, right? Which could lead you to depression. Those are the four P's. Now, for the suicide questions, right? Because you're going to ask your patients, what are the two main things you're going to always ask them is suicide, alcohol, drug abuse, okay, and self-harm, okay? Now, how are you going to ask them is these are a set of questions that you can ask. You can always be really respectful, right? You can tell them, I ask everyone this because your safety is very important to me, right? So have you had thoughts that life isn't worth living? Have you thought about killing yourself? Have you thought about how you would do it? Do you have access to what you would use? Because it's really important to know if they have access to what they're planning to use, right? um and then also past and protection. So you're going to ask them if they have ever tried to kill themselves before, right? And what happens when they actually stop, like, how do they stop feeling this way? Like, what helps you to stop yourself when you feel this way, right? So these are some of the questions that you can ask them. But you always need to keep in mind that you need to be respectful. You need to maintain that boundary. You do not want to cross it, and you always have to take permission before you proceed with these questions. So you're gonna ask them, "Hey, I'm gonna be asking you a few personal questions if that's all right with you," and then you proceed. Now, some of these common examples that could come from this lecture specifically are, of course, you do not start with closed questions at all or why questions, because that's going to narrow down the patient and it's going to feel like the patient's going to feel like you're pressuring them too much. Yani. So you're always going to give them open-ended questions. You're always going to ask directly about suicide and substances. So yes, you're going to be respectful. Yes, you're going to be talking to them in a way where they feel acknowledged, but you're always going to directly ask them about it. You're not going to be hesitant, okay? Because it's your job to know. And of course, you're not going to promise a cure 100% because not a lot of diseases have 100% cure. So do not just blabber things that you know are not going to happen. Okay? And also don't confront trauma too early. You need to move at the patient's pace. You need to give them that validation. You need to be listening to them and then, do everything like step by step. Don't take it too fast paced. And of course, you're going to maintain boundaries because that is really, 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 really important. And I think that's it for this lecture. So just to sum it up, right? This is just a summary of everything. You need to make sure that the patient is safe, that you're not asking them, like closed or why questions at the start. You're gonna give them their time to think about things, and you're of course gonna maintain professional boundaries with them. And the interview techniques are really, really important, and the four Ps as well. All right, let's move on to the questions. So, a 69-year-old woman presents to the psychiatrist with trouble sleeping, eating, and feeling nervous 4 days before a major exam. She's worried about her symptoms. What's the next step? Okay. So the answer here is B, which is where you're going to reassure her and tell her that it's normal and send her home. You're not going to do D because that's too blunt. Yani you need to still be respectful and validate their emotions. You're not going to just tell them, "Hey, stop worrying about the exam. That's so stupid. Like, why are you not sleeping because you have an exam?" Don't do that. You're going to reassure her. You're going to tell her, "Hey, it's fine. Everybody goes through this. You need to make sure, um, you know, wait, actually, how she's 69 and she's worrying about a major exam? That's so weird, but that's not the point. The point here is that you're supposed to reassure her and send her home and tell her that it's normal. Okay, question number two. A patient presents with symptoms of depression and is anxious and wants to leave the hospital. What will you do next? The answer here is be compassionate with him, be understanding with him. Don't push him into a corner. Talk to him, sit down, tell him, like ask him, what's the problem? Why do you want to go home? Why do you want to leave the hospital? All of this. So be nice with him. And that brings us to the end of our second lecture. Now let's move on to anxiety disorders 1 and 2. Okay, so okay, now let's overview anxiety in general. Anxiety is basically it's a normal process. Yes, it's just the adaptive alarm system that keeps us alive. Yani, it's something that every person goes through, but it becomes a disorder when it's too intense or it's too frequent and it lasts for too long. And also if it's interfering with your daily life. Okay, so there is normal anxiety, which is what happens to every person, yani. It's brief, it's also linked to a real threat, and it also resolves after the problem. So let's say you have like a major exam, you have neuro coming up, it's 6 credit hours. So of course everybody's anxious about this. This is normal anxiety. Pathological anxiety is when it's persistent, excessive, and it's often out of proportion. Yani it's really hard to control it, and it also can cause impairments. Okay, the key transition here is that the alarm no longer matches reality. So you're not no longer thinking logically. You're just too scared and you're constantly on the edge of your feet. Okay, now there's different types of anxiety disorders. There is generalized anxiety disorder, there's panic disorder, social anxiety disorder, specific phobias, and agoraphobia. So we also have PTSD and OCD, but they don't really come under DSM-5. So they're not really under anxiety disorders. Plus, they were not talked about in your lecture, so you don't really need to know them. Okay, now, just going to the pathological, like pathophysio of what actually happens in anxiety disorders is there's going to be, of course, hyperactive amygdala. Makes sense. You have your hyperactive amygdala, and your prefrontal cortex is not really the first line anymore. Your amygdala is the first line now. So there's going to be excessive fear response. Every little thing is going to cause a fear response in your body, right? So there's going to be reduced prefrontal cortex, which it cannot regulate this fear. So orbitofrontal cortex is not working at all, and your default mode network is going to be overactive. Remember, we said that the default mode network is what is the default setting for your brain. But when it's overactive, that means the patient is stuck in their head. They're overthinking, and they have this imagination all the time. Yani, okay. Also, for the neurotransmitters, there's going to be high levels of norepinephrine, which is a brother of cortisol, also a stress hormone, and less serotonin, which is the hormone that makes you happy, and also less GABA. And remember, we said that GABA is an inhibitory molecule, so if it's less, that means you cannot really inhibit your amygdala from being hyperactive, which makes sense. Okay, now different types of dysfunctions, or what actually happens is there's default mode network dysfunction, and then that happens, there's going to be worry loops. You cannot really switch off your mind even when you're doing tasks. So even when you're going from default mode network to your central executive network, you cannot really shut that part completely down because it's overactive. Okay, so you're going to have trouble concentrating even during tasks. There's also going to be high norepinephrine. We talked about this. It's gonna cause hyperarousal, tachycardia, keep you more on the edge, and it's gonna be released from locus coeruleus as well as adrenal gland. There's gonna be low serotonin and low GABA, which is gonna be called as weak breaks because those are the breaks that help you calm down. Yeah, but because there are less, you cannot calm down anymore. Okay, now let's talk about the fight flight physiology. So the threat happens, the amygdala notices this threat, right? Now the amygdala is going to go to the hypothalamus, it's going to activate the hypothalamus, which is going to activate the HPA axis and the sympathetic system. We covered this. We said that the adrenal glands get active, it's going to release norepinephrine, it's going to release cortisol, all of this. Now, when it's short term, When it's short term, it's good because it's supposed to be short term. It's supposed to be there only for like a little bit, and then it's gonna supposed to be like resolved after the problem is gone. So it's gonna cause tachycardia, sweating, muscle tension, dilated pupils, all because sympathetic nervous system is involved. But if it's long term and if it's chronic, if it's constantly happening, it can cause more dangerous stuff like hypertension, atherosclerosis, diabetes, and heart disease. Now, in your lecture, the doctor mentioned how it causes atherosclerosis, which is going to be in the future slide. So I'm going to mention it very briefly. But now let's come on to the default mode network as well. The default mode network is active at rest, right? It's active at rest. When you're resting, or for example, you right now, actually, no, you're going to be in the central executive mode because you're actually learning. But when you're like laying down, looking at reels, whatever, then it's going to be default mode network. That's going to be active. So you're going to have this future thinking, you're going to think about the future, you're going to have self-reflection. But if there's anxiety and if the default mode network is overactive and it's hyper connected to the amygdala, then you're going to have catastrophic thinking. So you're going to be thinking, but then it's going to be catastrophic. There's going to be a lot of what ifs. It's going to be like, what if I die before I achieve this? Or what if this happens to me before I achieve this? So there's going to be like a lot of catastrophic thinking, right? And it's also going to be there's also going to be failure to deactivate default mode network completely during tasks because it's overactive. So now there's going to be poor concentration. Okay, now for the neurotransmitters, we talked about serotonin, it's going to be low. Talked about GABA, also going to be low. This is what causes the weaker breaks. Norepinephrine is going to be high. Why? Because it's the brother of cortisol. It's what's going to cause these panic attacks and anxiety. Glutamate is also going to be high. Glutamate is the excitatory neurotransmitter. It's also going to be high, which is going to cause, more anxiety. So serotonin, GABA are going to be low, and norepinephrine, glutamate are going to be high. Okay, so let's talk about generalized anxiety disorder. Generalized anxiety disorder is chronic, it's excessive, and it's very hard to control. Now, it's about multiple areas. And you're when you meet these patients with generalized anxiety disorder, when you talk to them, they're gonna have anxiety about multiple areas. It could be work, it could be health, it could be family, it could be their future. They worry about literally it could be anything in these areas, right? Now, the worry can be present on more days. And it's termed as generalized anxiety disorder when it's present for more than 6 months. It's really important. Okay, and anxiety is also free floating, so it's not limited to specific situations. Now, the lifetime prevalence is 5 to 7%. Of course, it's more common in women. Why? Because in women, we have more responsibilities and we tend to have more stuff on our plate than males, and we have a higher or a more advanced limbic system. So we feel our emotions more, we feel our emotions more deeply, which could lead us to have generalized anxiety disorder. And it's also one of the most common mental illnesses. It runs in families, and it's more common with physical illnesses and also low socioeconomic status. Okay, now there's psychic symptoms of generalized anxiety disorder, and then there's somatic symptoms. Psychic symptoms are symptoms of any the brain. The somatic symptoms are symptoms of the body, right? So for the psychic symptoms, you're gonna have you're gonna feel on the edge, your mind is gonna go blank, poor concentration because the default mode network is gonna be overactive, there's gonna be irritability, all of that. For somatic symptoms, there's gonna be muscle tension, there's gonna be headaches, there's going to be back pain, GI symptoms, palpitations. All of this is going to be somatic symptoms. Now, for generalized anxiety disorder, as we said, there's going to be excessive anxiety and worry for more than 6 months, which is when we say that it's generalized anxiety disorder. And it's difficult to control this worrying. And it's associated, so DSM, according to the DSM-5 scale, there's 6 symptoms. And from these 6 symptoms, if any of the three are present or more than three are present, that's when you label your patient as having generalized anxiety disorder. So the symptoms are restlessness or feeling keyed up, so like on their edge, right? Easily fatigued, difficulty concentrating, irritability, muscle tension, and sleep disturbances. Okay, so if there's more than three present in our patients, more than three symptoms of these present in your patients, you're gonna be diagnosing them with generalized anxiety disorder. Okay, and think that's it here. Yes. For the common patterns that you can notice in generalized anxiety disorder, patients is they're gonna have catastrophic thinking. So they're gonna always think that the worst case is gonna happen. Okay. And they're also gonna have this like ideology in mind, which is gonna be all or nothing. So it's gonna be either that they're gonna have total success or they're gonna be complete failure. So there's no in the middle, right? There's also gonna be overgeneralization. So if there's one thing that goes bad, they say that everything's going to be bad. There's also personalization, which is, let's say something happens, which is a neutral event, but they take it as a personal event. They're going to be like, this is happening to attack me, or this is happening because the universe wants me to die, stuff like that. There's also filtering. Filtering is when you focus only on the negatives. So they only focus on the negatives. And also fortune telling, which is they basically predict the disaster without evidence. So they're going to be like, oh, this is going to happen. But there's no evidence, but they're just putting themselves in that position, right? So these are some of the symptoms or some of the things that patients can present with. There's also going to be chronic activation of stress hormones, right, like norepinephrine, cortisol, which is going to cause cardiovascular and metabolic risk. There's going to be high cardiovascular and metabolic risk only because it can lead to atherosclerosis, which could lead to heart attacks. Really, really important. The patients themselves, what do they actually present with? There's going to be rocking, bruxism, and fidgeting. Rocking and fidgeting is we know what that is. For bruxism, it's basically like they're constantly like biting on their teeth. Like their teeth are like, like I don't know what the word is, but they're constantly like biting on their teeth. Okay. There's also impaired performance at work and studies. They have like poor concentration skills or they're blanking out a lot. There's also family impact, which is really important. So if your family if if your father had anxiety and kids grew up watching that, they can actually mirror it because there are mirror neurons that can actually mirror it, and then they can also potentially have anxiety. Okay, that's generalized anxiety disorder. To sum it up, it's anxiety or severe worrying for more than 6 months. There should be more than three or more than three symptoms out of the six symptoms for it to be classified as generalized anxiety disorder. The prevalence is 5 to 7%, and women are more common to get generalized anxiety disorder, mostly because they have more responsibilities. And then what do our patients present with? They present with fidgeting, bruxism, and rocking. Okay, now let's move on to panic disorder. Panic disorder is recurrent unexpected panic attacks, right? These are just abrupt surges of intense fear or discomfort. And they usually happen out of the blue, like there's no clear trigger. And it's followed by more than 1 month or equal to 1 month of persistent concern about additional attacks or significant maladaptive behavior change, which is avoidance. Okay, so what's panic disorder is it peaks within minutes and it usually resolves really fast. So it's not like generalized anxiety disorder where it's going to stay for like a longer period of time. No, panic disorder happens within minutes and it's resolved within minutes too. And symptoms that you need are these are the six symptoms. Yeah, these are this. No, actually, there are more than six symptoms, but you need more than four of these symptoms to be calling it a panic disorder. When you think about it logically, there's going to be palpitations, there's going to be sweating, trembling, shortness of breath, choking sensations, severe chest pain, right? There's also going to be derealization, depersonalization, fear of losing control or going crazy, and also fear of dying. So if there's more than four symptoms out of the listed ones, then you're gonna label it as panic disorder. There's a tachycardia, dizziness, shortness of breath, chest tightness, feeling of detachment, where you feel like you're just feeling detached from everything. Fear of losing control or also dying. Okay, now again, from the pathophysio, amygdala misfires. It's going to perceive a threat when none is present. That's how panic disorder happens. There's no clear trigger, right? And what it does is amygdala perceives a threat and it's going to send a very strong signal to the locus coeruleus, which is going to release norepinephrine. And because it's going to send a very strong signal, the norepinephrine surge is going to be very, very high. It's going to be 10 times usual the actual anxiety surge that actually happens. And when that happens, the norepinephrine is going to produce intense somatic symptoms. And when we mean intense, we mean chest pain, tachycardia, shortness of breath. All of this is happening because there's a very high surge of norepinephrine. Then the prefrontal cortex is also going to fail to regulate any of this, right? So what's going to happen is there's going to be catastrophic misinterpretations. So there's going to be, oh, your chest is hurting. You're going to think that it's a heart attack and you're going to die. So that's panic disorder. Now, how do you differentiate between generalized anxiety disorder and panic attack? Generalized anxiety disorder is chronic, right? It's a slow burn of anxiety. It goes over months, from hours to months, and it's lower intensity. Panic is like acute spike. It goes very intense in a short period of time, and then it's going to resolve very quick too. So the key word for panic is it's going to be unexpected, it's going to be abrupt onset, and it's going to be a shorter duration. So when you look at this, you can look at how generalized anxiety disorder is chronic and it's like persistent, right? But panic attack is it peaks within minutes and it's a very acute spike and then it just resolves within minutes. But this can go over months and years. Okay. Really important is to always check your patients for other differentials as well before labeling them as generalized anxiety disorder patients or panic disorder patients. You're going to actually look at the different things as well. For example, you're going to look at hyperthyroidism, pheochromocytoma, cardiorespiratory system. So erythemas, asthma, COPD. You're going to look at all of this. You're going to run basic tests on your patients, which is going to be physical examination, TSH for the thyroid, CBC to look at everything, ECG, toxicology, screening tests. You're going to look at everything, and if everything's normal, that's when you're going to proceed with diagnosing your patients with, psychiatric disorders. Okay, we did generalized anxiety disorder and we did panic disorder. Let's move on to social anxiety disorder. Social anxiety disorder is also persistent and it's a marked fear or anxiety in social situations. And the most common way you can remember this is that the primary fear in patients that have social anxiety is negative evaluation or humiliation from the people around them. Okay, and also being judged is really it's a really important fear for patients that have social anxiety disorder as well. So there is social situations that are going to almost always provoke fear in these patients, so they're going to avoid social gatherings and everything. Okay, so of course, for the prevalence, it's very prevalent. It's very common. Not very common, you need 12%, as compared to generalized anxiety disorder, which was 5 to 7%. So it's quite as common. Um, for the onset, it's typically in the adolescence age, so it's going to be in around the age of 13 to 20 years, and it's also often comorbid. So it doesn't come alone. It's going to come with depression, it's going to come with substance use, right? And many patients also present with depression or anxiety rather than explicitly saying that it's social fear. They're going to present with anxiety and depression, and then later on, you're going to find out that it's a social anxiety disorder. Now, how are they going to behave? What are they going to do? What do our patients actually, like how do they actually present? For behavioral symptoms, they're going to avoid parties. They're going to basically avoid all of these large group gatherings. So eating in public, presentations, teamwork, all of this, they're going to be avoiding that. They're going to prefer isolation and staying at home. For cognitive, they're going to have this fear of constantly being watched, being judged, or feeling humiliated. And they're also going to feel not good. They're going to feel like they're not enough for the society. And then there's also physical symptoms. So they're going to have sweating, tremor. They're also going to have a dry mouth, palpitations, and social situations. So let's say, for example, someone wants to go on stage to talk about, they're going to give a speech, but they have social anxiety disorder. So they're going to have this instant physical symptoms such as sweating, tremor, palpitations, and stuff, etc., before they go on stage because they have that anxiety. Okay, now when you look at the pathophysio of what actually happens, of course, it's connected to the amygdala as everything else is. So it's going to be hyperactive amygdala when facing social cues, which is, faces, scrutiny, all of this. And there's, of course, going to be a weak prefrontal cortex. So there's going to be exaggerated fear response. And childhood factors play a really important role in social anxiety disorder. For example, criticism, bullying, and emotionally cold or critical caregivers contribute to social fear. So let's say if you had a very emotionally unavailable mother or cold mother as a child in your childhood, or an indifferent dad, then you can grow up to get social anxiety disorder. Okay, now for the treatments of social anxiety disorder, the most important one that you need to know is the combination therapy, the combination treatment, which is the therapy plus the medication. So you're going to give them cognitive behavioral therapy, and you're going to give them medications that can basically help them. Now, for specific phobias, we talked about generalized, we talked about panic, and we talked about social anxiety disorder. Okay, now let's talk about specific phobias. For specific phobias, it's this excessive fear of a specific object or a situation. For example, spiders. We have a phobia of spiders. You don't like spiders, right? So the fear is out of proportion to actual danger and persistent. And it's usually going to be more than 6 months as well, like generalized anxiety disorder. And it often coexists with other anxiety disorders. Okay, that's specific phobia to specific things. For agoraphobia is the fear of being around people or being like, in crowds or in places. Now, this is going to be marked fear or anxiety from like there's one, two, three, four, five. There's five things here, but if the patient has two or more than two out of these five, that's when they have agoraphobia. So public transport, right? Public transport, open spaces, enclosed places, crowds, or being outside, home alone. Okay, so this is when they have agoraphobia, which is just they can't really stand crowds, they can't really stand public spaces, they can't stand the public transport. So they avoid these situations. They don't want to be there, and they require either someone to go with them. They can't really do it alone. So they require a companion, or if they don't have this companion, they have like intent fear and they cannot do it alone. That's agoraphobia. Yeah, they also feel like they cannot escape. That's a part of their phobia as well. Now, this is really important. This is just what the patients are going to present with and how you can label their different psychiatric disorders. So, if there is trauma history and they're re-experiencing it, you're going to think PTSD, which we didn't really cover, but it makes sense. If there's obsessions, compulsations, it's going to be OCD. You're going to cover this later in the lectures, inshallah. If it's discrete panic attacks with avoidance, it's going to be panic disorder plus agoraphobia. Okay, and if there's marked fear of something specific, it's going to be specific phobia. And if there's a fear of social scrutiny, so you're feeling you're scared of like negative evaluation, being judged, all of that, then it's social anxiety disorder. And if there's persistent generalized worry in many domains, such as work, family, future, etc., then it's going to be generalized anxiety disorder. That's all the disorders. But now we're going to be talking about why anxiety is more common in women. We already talked about this. We said that it's more common in women mostly because they have a more advanced limbic system, they have more responsibilities, and of course hormonal fluctuations are also a really really important role that plays in anxiety for women. There's going to be estrogen, progesterone, which affects the serotonin and GABA, which could basically bring the serotonin and GABA down, which could cause anxiety, because in anxiety, serotonin and GABA are down, which are the weak breaks, right? And your norepinephrine and your glutamate are going to be high. And also, because they have this persistent access of the HPA and more cortisol, what happens is that it could lead to erythrosclerosis, right? These cells could start clumping up together and form erythrosclerosis. So it's really, really important to be measuring hypertension, looking for their blood sugar, insulin resistance, and also type 2 diabetes in patients that have anxiety. And it's really important to treat anxiety because it could prevent cardiometabolic diseases, again, such as heart failure, erythemas, atherosclerosis, and even cardiac blocks because of atherosclerosis. And then why does it actually happen? Like what's the cause of anxiety? There could be ego expectations, right? So people could idealize their future self and then start getting anxiety over the fact that that might not happen, right? There's also like a very, very major gap between what your expectations are and what the reality actually is. So that could cause a very dissatisfaction, a sort of dissatisfaction in our patients, and which could lead to anxiety as well. There is also intolerance of uncertainty, right? So the brain treats the not knowing as potential threats. So, for example, you don't know what you're going to do in the future. Now, that could lead your brain to thinking that, you know, we don't know what to do in the future. So you're gonna have that anxious or that anxiety thought that you don't really know what to do in future and you need to know everything. And that could also lead to anxiety. Now, pharmacological treatments are really important for anxiety disorders. The first line for almost all of your anxiety disorders are SSRIs, and there could also be SNRIs. SSRIs is sertraline and escitalopram are the first lines for all anxiety disorders. The mechanism is, of course, they're going to increase serotonin, which is going to strengthen your prefrontal cortex, control over amygdala because the serotonin is down and there's no break for the amygdala. But if you basically increase serotonin, then the amygdala is going to have a break. And it's also going to reduce default motor network rumination. So you're not going to be imagining stuff, there's not going to be a lot of overthinking, right? The onset, it usually takes weeks, but then you need to have adequate trial before you can actually judge the response of the patient. There's also short-term benzodiazepines like lorazepam and clonazepam, which could be given for acute severe anxiety or panic attacks, but they're also limited in use. There's also beta blockers for physical symptoms such as your chest pain and stuff like that. For GABA enhancing drugs, because of course GABA is also low, so you can increase GABA and it's going to inhibit the amygdala from acting. You can give benzos, but always the first lines are SSRIs. Now, psychotherapy is also really important. So we have cognitive behavioral therapy, which is CBT, which is going to identify challenges in the cognitive distortations, right? And it's going to basically it's CBT is very, very important to give with a combination. So you're always going to give it with a combination of medication plus psychotherapy, which is the most effective in patients across anxiety disorders. Oh, and we're done with the lecture. So now we're going to be jumping to questions, but I hope that's clear. If you guys have any doubts, please always feel free to reach out to my number. All right. So, what is the most common fear in social anxiety disorder? Okay, so the most common fear in social anxiety disorder is fear of negative evaluation by others. That's their most common primary fear. Okay, question two. A 35-year-old patient presents with excessive worry about daily activities, difficulty controlling their anxiety, restlessness, fatigue, difficulty concentrating, muscle tension, and sleep disturbances for the past 6 months. What is the most likely diagnosis? Okay, this one's really easy. The answer here is B, which is generalized anxiety disorder. Why? Because they're presenting with symptoms of generalized anxiety disorder, right? And it's more than three. So they have excessive worry about daily activities, difficulty controlling their anxiety, restlessness, fatigue, difficulty concentrating because their default motor network is always overactive, muscle tension because that's the somatic symptoms, and sleep disturbances, also somatic symptoms, for the past 6 months, which is the time period or the duration for generalized anxiety disorder. Okay. A 30-year-old woman experiences sudden episodes of intense fear with palpitations, chest tightness, shortness of breath, and fear of dying that peak within 10 minutes and resolve within 30 minutes. Medical workup is negative. She now avoids going to the supermarket alone for fear an episode might happen. Which DSM-5 concept best explains her current avoidance? Okay, the answer here is D, agoraphobia related to panic disorder. Because if you look at the question, she actually has panic disorder, right? She has this panic attacks. But because of these panic attacks, she's actually avoiding going to the supermarket alone because of the fear that an episode might happen, which is agoraphobia related to the panic disorder. And now we're going to be moving on to our final lecture, which is going to be mood disorders. So let's start. Okay, mood disorders, there's disturbances in the emotional state affecting thinking, behavior, and functioning. Now, there's two major groups for mood disorders. There's unipolar, which is major depression or dysthymia, and bipolar spectrum disorders. Now, it's also highly prevalent, chronic, and strongly linked to suicide. Very important. Okay. Now, when you actually talk about the unipolar and the bipolar, this is what you see. For the unipolar, there's going to be only one episode. There's going to be like one episode in a free interval of time. But when you're talking about bipolar, there's going to be depression, right? But there's also going to be states, or there's also going to be like periods of mania between this depression episode. So there's going to be depression, but then the patient is going to be very, very hyperactive all of a sudden, very excited, and then they're going to go back into depression. So that's bipolar disorder, and for unipolar, it's a major depression or dysthymia. All right. So as we were discussing, for unipolar mood disorders, it's only going to be depressive episodes. There's going to be no history of mania or hypomania. Okay. For bipolar disorders, there is going to be depressive episodes, but there's also going to be at least one maniac or hypomaniac episode. Bipolar are further divided. We're going to get into that. Now, okay, now the treatment is going to differ. So it's going to be antidepressants are more core in unipolar because you're just targeting the depression episodes, right? For bipolar, because it's depression with your hypomania or mania episodes, you're going to give them mood stabilizers. Okay. Now, for the epidemiology, it usually affects 20% of the population, and it's most common psychiatric illness worldwide as well. For the male to female ratio, of course, female are more prone to getting bipolar or unipolar disorders or just mood disorders in general because why? They have a greater limbic sensitivity, they have just yani, a more deeper emotional intelligence than males. There's also increased mortality and morbidity in diabetes, MI, stroke, and large quality of life reduction. Very important is to also know that there's high suicide risk, and there's a higher suicide risk in unmarried older white males that are depressed. Okay, so unmarried older white males have a higher risk of suicide. Okay, now what are the risk factors and the causes of depression? What can actually cause depression? So there's biological causes, right, which could be family history, serotonin transporter abnormalities, so just genetically, like genetically not modified serotonin receptors could cause depression. Chronic medical illnesses could cause depression. There's also psychological, so let's say lower self-esteem of the patients, perfectionism, negative thinking patterns, so they're always filtering out stuff, right? There's also environmental, which means there's financial instability, there's marital problems, there is a trauma, or they're feeling lonely, or they just have a low socioeconomic status that could also lead to depression. Now, depression is heterogeneous, so there's a lot of things that can cause depression, interacting from different domains such as biological, psychological, or even environmental or social factors. So when you actually look at how broad the causes of depression are, it's heterogeneous because a lot of things can cause it. Now, there is a clinical picture of major depression, which are going to be persistent low mood, anhedonia, and loss of interest. Okay, there's also vegetative symptoms such as sleep changes, cycle and sleep changes, and appetite slash weight changes, fatigue, psychomotor agitation or retardation. So people are not as active, yani they're easily fatigued as well. Cognitive symptoms could be poor concentration, indecisiveness, guilt, they feel like they're not worth it, so there's worthlessness, and of course, they're gonna have suicidal ideation and behavior is gonna be common and must always, always, always be assessed, and patients are going under depression. Now, for the DSM-5 criteria for major depressive disorder, um, okay, yes, for major depressive disorder, which is MDD, you need to make sure that the patient is feeling their symptoms for more than 2 weeks, okay? For more than 2 weeks or equal to 2 weeks of depressed mood or loss of interest, it's going to be major depressive disorder. And more than four symptoms of the ones that are listed, right? So appetite, weight change, sleep disturbances, psychomotor changes, fatigue, anhedonia, which is a reduced ability to experience pleasure and in activities that would actually cause pleasure previously, but they just do not anymore. That's anhedonia. There's also symptoms that can cause significant distress slash impairment, and this is not due to substances or any other medical condition. Yani it's just that these symptoms themselves cause significant distress to the patient. So That's a major depressive disorder. So more than 2 weeks, low persistent mood is gonna be major depressive disorder, and these are the symptoms. You need to have four or more than four to be labeled as major depressive disorder. Okay, now there's also going to be somatic symptoms in depression. There's going to be headaches, there's going to be migraines, palpitations, GI problems, chronic back pain, or neck pain. And patients usually they present with like these symptoms, right? But they're not gonna tell you that they're depressed. They're mostly gonna come with physical complaints of like back pain or chronic pain or GI problems, mostly because of the stigma and the society judgment, right? So it's always important to screen for mood, especially when it's recurrent and unexplained somatic symptoms, right? Like you have run all tests and nothing is wrong with their body, but they keep having these, symptoms of back pain, neck pain, or even abdominal pain, then you need to check for their mood. Now, there's subtypes of depressive disorders. So we talked about MDD, which is major depressive disorder, which is when there's a low, persistent low mood for almost 2 weeks or more than 2 weeks. And then there is persistent depressive disorder, which is dysthymia. This is also, yeah, sorry, this is also uh depressive disorder, but the only difference here is going to be more than 2 years. Okay, so major depressive disorder is only 2 weeks or more than 2 weeks, but persistent depressive disorder is going to be for more than 2 years. Okay, and how you can differentiate between these two is in the exam. Commonly when the patient presents and when you ask them, the question is going to be structured in a way where you always ask them when was the last time they felt okay, or when was the last time they were happy. For major depressive disorder, patients are going to say that less than 2 weeks, yani, or more than 2 weeks, For persistent depressive, they're going to say more than 2 years. So that's how you differentiate between them. There's also double depression, which is just major depressive episode superimposed on dysthymia. That's what double depression. It's basically persistent depressive disorder, which was termed as dysthymia. That's what it was called, plus MDD. So it's going to be a mix of both of those. Psychotic depression is the major depressive disorder plus hallucinations or delusions. That's what psychotic depression is. And then melanchthonic depression is also it's also like a subtype of major depressive disorder, MDD, like psychotic depression. But for melanchthonic, it's more severe. It's profound anhedonia. They don't find interest in doing anything. There's also lack of mood reactivity, early morning awakening, significant weight loss, and excessive guilt. So what I want you to keep in mind here is that you have your MDD, right? Your MDD is going to be for 2 weeks or more than 2 weeks. Okay, 2 weeks or more than 2 weeks. And under it is psychotic depression and melanchthonic depression. For psychotic, it's going to be with hallucinations. And for melanchthonic, it's severe. It's a more severe form of MDD. Okay, double depression is just MDD plus dysthymia, which is persistent depressive disorder, which is for more than 2 years. This is what I want you to remember from this slide, okay? It's really important. There's also special depressive syndromes like postpartum blues, postpartum depression, and seasonal affective disorder. Postpartum blues is usually in the first few weeks after delivery. It's common and it's mild, and the most common way you can actually differentiate between postpartum blues and postpartum depression is postpartum blues is when the mother still cares about the baby. So she is depressed, but she still cares about the baby. Postpartum depression is when she does not care about the baby anymore. It's very severe. It's persistent depression, and it usually it's within the first 12 months of the delivery. This is in the first few weeks of the delivery. So postpartum blues is in the first few weeks. Postpartum depression is in the first 12 months, okay? Then you have seasonal affective disorder. Seasonal affective disorder is it's usually depends on the seasons. So if you have met people that have lived in Canada, you know that when winters come up, it's very gloomy and it's it's very like sad, and they get really depressed because of the seasons. So it's the seasons that affects them. There's oversleeping, there's low energy, they don't want to do anything, and this is when they respond to light therapy. When you give them light therapy, that's when they're gonna have better symptoms. There's also late onset depression, which is more than 60 years of age. Patients, they usually have late onset of depression, and it could signal early dementia and monitor cognition. So you need to monitor their cognition because it could significantly tell you that this could lead to dementia. Okay, now the depression, how does it actually come into place? Is that there's key monoamines, right? Our key monoamines are serotonin. And where is serotonin located? It's in the raphe nuclei in the brainstem. Very important to know. Okay, now this serotonin, of course, it's low, which was what causes your depression. So there's low serotonin, there's also low dopamine, so there's lack of motivation. The person doesn't want to do anything, which is also what tells us why they have anhedonia. There's also low norepinephrine, which means there's fatigue, there's low energy, right? And what are the first lines for depression? Of course, SSRIs. They increase serotonin, and there's also other agents that could target norepinephrine and dopamine pathways, but it's mostly SSRIs that are given. Now, the brain circuits in depression are PFC is of course hypoactive. Why? Because the amygdala is the front line, which is what makes sense of it having in depression, right? And especially the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex and orbitofrontal cortex, they don't have that executive control and top-down regulation on the limbic system. So the limbic system is constantly viewing everything as negative, which is what's causing your depression. There's also amygdala hyperactivity, which is what I just discussed. Hippocampal atrophy is always, need to remember this, it's always with chronic depression, which is why you need to treat depression ASAP to not be able to leading it to not to not lead it to hippocampal atrophy. That's your goal. But if there is hippocampal atrophy, that means the patient has had depression for a very long time or for a very chronic period of time. So it could be a dysthymia or persistent depressive disorder for just for more than 2 years. There's also default motor network, which is overactive, so they're overthinking. They're always in their mind. They're viewing everything as a catastrophic thinking perspective. Okay, now there's HPA axis and stress and depression. Now, of course, there's going to be hyperactive HPA axis. There's going to be high levels of cortisol, and because there's high levels of cortisol, there's going to be insomnia, restlessness, and moon phases. Moon phases is a one common feature that you're going to see in patients that present with depression, mostly because there's going to be high levels of cortisol. Again, why? Because the amygdala is hyperactive and the HPA axis is hyperactive as well. And because there's chronic stress and high cortisol, it could lead to neurotoxicity of the hippocampus. Again, could lead to hippocampal atrophy if it's not treated, diabetes, and cardiovascular diseases. You're gonna have to screen and medically rule out other conditions, as we talked about earlier on. Before you give them the diagnosis of psychiatric illness, you always have to rule out other conditions such as hypothyroidism, hypercalcemia, B12 folate deficiencies, because all of these can also cause symptoms of depression. There's also a scale which is called the PHQ-9 scale. It's a self-item report tool for depression. It's going to be you score depression severity and guides management. So it was mentioned in your slides. So I would suggest that you remember the scale for depression PHQ-9. And you also have to check for substance-induced depression because it could be due to medications. They could be having symptoms of depression due to medications. Okay, wait, actually, let's go back and let's briefly talk about the PHQ-9. So it's gonna basically score your depression, and it's gonna have a total of score from 27. And if the score is between 0 to 9, it's mild. And if it's 10 to 14, it's moderate. And if it's 15 to 27, then it's very, very severe. Now, this is just a scale to look for depression, and that's pretty much it. Okay, now this slide is really important. So really tested on in the exam. So you need to know this really important slide. There's psychodynamic and cognitive perspectives in depression. Now, what do we mean by this? There were two scientists. There was Freud and there was Beck, right? They had their own theories about depression. Freud said that depression was anger turned inward. So, like, there is anger on something, but you're turning it towards yourself. That's what depression is. So, if, for example, after a loss of a loved one or self-criticism, you're directing all of this guilt to yourself. That's what Freud said depression is, in his words. For Beck's cognitive theory, This is what Freud said. He said that the anger is towards any object, but it's redirected to you. Okay. For Beck's cognitive theory was a triad. So he said, sorry, my bad. He said that there's a negative view of self, of world, and of future. So you're viewing yourself as negative, you're viewing the world as negative, and you're also viewing your future as negative. So self, world, and future is what was Beck's cognitive theory about depression. And how do you treat depression? CBT is the most gold standard way to go for it because it aims to correct the distorted thoughts and also breaks the vicious cycles of all of the negative thoughts. Yeah, so the best outcomes usually come with a combination of antidepressants, which are your SSRIs, plus your psychotherapy, which is your cognitive behavioral therapy. Now, of course, you need to make sure that there's also lifestyle changes, for example, exercise, because exercise increases serotonin and also dopamine release, so the patient's gonna feel better. There's also sleep hygiene, so their sleep cycle is good, they're following a strict sleeping schedule, healthy diet, social engagements, they're also avoiding isolation because isolation can lead to more negative thoughts and also substance use. For psychotic depression, because they're having hallucinations, you'll also have to give them antipsychotics with antidepressants and maybe also electroconvulsive therapy, which is where you basically treat patients with psychotic depression through like giving them this electric shock, right? Okay. Now we're going to go to bipolar disorder. So we talked about depression. Now we're going to talk about bipolar disorder, right? Depression was a unipolar disorder. For bipolar disorder, there's a chronic episodic mood disorder. Now it could be divided into two. So there's bipolar disorder 1 and bipolar disorder 2. Now the lifetime prevalence is usually 6.4%. Suicide rate is also really high in bipolar disorders, about 12%, which is double major depression. And about major depression was like 7%, but in bipolar disorders, it's usually 12%. Okay, now many patients they usually present with depression first. So they're gonna have depression as an initial episode, and then you're gonna give them antidepressants, but it's not gonna work, and that's when you're gonna find out that this was a bipolar disorder, right? So then you're gonna give them mood stabilizers, not mood stabilizers. So what happens is they're usually misdiagnosed. So why? Because bipolar disorders they present with depressive episodes first, and then it goes into hypomania or maniac episodes. That is why. Okay. So you always have to be mindful of the fact that you can miss bipolar disorders. Okay. Now there's clinical features of how patients would present. So there's elevated or irritable mood, plus very, very marked increased of energy slash activity for 1 week. So how do bipolar disorder patients present? There's going to be 2 weeks of depressive episodes and then 1 week of the mania episode. And for the mania episodes, there's going to be symptoms, which are termed as I dig fast as a mnemonic. There's indiscretion, which is risk taking. So they're going to take risks, right? They're going to be distracted. They're going to have this grandiosity or like a very high self-esteem that they're the best and no one's like better than them. And then there's also like goal directed activity increases. There's a flight of ideas, like they're very, very, like they're very energetic, they want to do everything, they want to take the risks. They don't want to sleep. Their sleep is also decreased, and they're very talkative. So they're very like they're talking at a very fast paced like pace as well. Okay, now there's depressive episodes which are clinically similar to unipolar depression, which is why it's really hard to differentiate between the two. Now there's mania and then there's depression, right? So bipolar patients they spend most of their time in depressive state. So when there's mixed state, what happens is there's depressive episodes and then right after depressive episodes, there's a high surge of energy, irritability, wasting thoughts, taking risks, less sleeping schedule, all of that plus a very, very high suicide risk, and it's very difficult to treat as well. This is what I was talking about. We were talking about how there's different types. So there's bipolar 1 and bipolar 2. Bipolar 1 is when there's at least one full maniac episode. So you have the depressive episode plus you have at least one full maniac episode. For bipolar 2, it's at least one hypomaniac episode. Okay? how you can differentiate between bipolar 1 and bipolar 2 is bipolar 1 has psychosis and it often needs hospitalization. Bipolar 2 Bipolar 2 does not have psychosis, so it doesn't have a fully active mania. It's usually hypomania, but it has a major depressive disorder. Like the depression is so bad that can actually lead the patient to suicide, which is why it's very, very dangerous. So bipolar 2 is more dangerous than bipolar 1. Okay, now for the neurobiological, like the pathophysiology of just bipolar disorder in general, there's going to be orbitofrontal cortex and prefrontal cortex that are going to be underactive. So they're not going to be able to control amygdala at all. Amygdala is going to be hyperactive, and there's going to be the reward pathway is going to be dysregulated. The reward pathway, technically, is the VTA, which is ventral tegmental area, from the nucleus incumbens, which gives you the dopamine surge, right? There's going to be excessive dopamine, and there's going to be hypersensitive reward system in mania. There's gonna be dysregulation of that. So they're gonna be very impulsive to because this is dysregulated and there's like high surges of dopamine. Then there's also circadian and sleep disruptions, which are integral. And one major way of fixing bipolar disorder is actually putting patients into deep sleep, which could recharge their prefrontal cortex because sleep worsens mania, by the way. Like if the sleeping schedule is not good, it worsens mania. So mania, as when we talk about like the transmitters, when you talk about neurotransmitters, what does neurotransmitters in mania look like? So in mania, there's going to be excessive glutamate activity and reduced GABA inhibition, which makes sense. Glutamate is the excitatory molecule, so it's going to be high, and the GABA is the inhibitory molecule, so it's going to be low, right? So there's hyperexcitability. Why? Because there's high glutamate molecules. Now, bipolar states, they show an imbalance between excitatory glutamate and inhibitory GABA across the prefrontal cortex. Okay, really important. There's also going to be mitochondrial dysfunction. This is so important because of mitochondria being not able to function properly. There's impaired ATP production, and if there's impaired ATP production, what's going to happen is there's going to be increased reactive oxygen species, which is going to disrupt the calcium. It's going to disrupt the calcium, and because of this, the neurons are not going to be firing well, and there's going to be mood switching. It's really, really important, okay? Mitochondrial dysfunction. There's also it's highly heritable. Mood disorders are highly, highly heritable. And so is depression. So that's one thing. 70 to 90% of them are heritable. There's also chronic stress, of course, which is going to activate the HPA axis because the amygdala is hyperactive. And there's also triggering the gene. So environment you could have the gene, but your gene could be triggered later in life because of stress, which could lead to the illness. Now, as we talked about, deep slow wave actually restores the prefrontal cortex emotion regulation and it's going to reduce reactivity, right? So, mania is associated with a severe reduction in total sleep. And so, when you put the patient in deep sleep, it can actually make the patient feel better and it could actually improve their anti-maniac strategy. It's like an anti-maniac strategy with many mood stabilizers. Now, coming on to the risk factors. So, the risk factors for developing mood disorders are first degree relative with bipolar disorder. So, if you have a first degree relative with a bipolar disorder, you could get bipolar disorder. There's also early 20s onset, major life stress, substance use, or sleep disruption. Because, again, as we said, sleep disruption can trigger episodes of mania. Now, substance induced mood disorders as well. So there could be medications that could induce mood disorders. There's also medical causes, which is why you need to rule out medical causes before you diagnose your patients with psychiatric disorders, correct? Because hypothyroidism or even hyperthyroidism can actually trigger bipolar disorder. So the major cause can't just be bipolar disorder. It might just be something that's underlying, that's causing. So you can treat the thyroid and then it could fix a bipolar disorder. Okay, now when you're differentiating between other conditions, for unipolar depression, there's going to be no history of mania or hypomania, right? So it's just going to be depression. That's it. For borderline personality disorders, there's going to be rapid mood shifts over hours triggered by interpersonal events. And the orbitofrontal cortex impairment is also going to be there, but shorter episodes. You're going to take this in the future lectures, but just so you know, I'm going to put them here. There's also schizoaffective, which is just psychotic symptoms that are persistent outside of the mood episodes. So there's going to be mood episodes, but then there's also going to be psychotic symptoms outside of these mood episodes. Okay, for the pharmacological management of bipolar disorder, lithium is the gold standard that you give. Of course, you're also going to give them deep sleep waves, and you can also give them CBT, if I'm right. But the lithium is the gold standard for mood stabilizers, right? And there's also lamotrigine, which is very helpful in bipolar depression prophylaxis, but there's less weight gain and sedation. So that's one thing. Okay, now with bipolar pharmacotherapy, it's really tricky because the patients themselves, they don't want to take medications and then they skip medications, so they're not very compliant with them. And the side effects could also be obesity. So the patients might gain weight and then they might get cranky and they just don't want to do it, right? So there's high rates of like self-medication with alcohol and drugs, there's poor adherence. So there could be a lot of challenges in bipolar pharmacotherapy, which is why you need to have ways where you're not really treating it with just medications because the patients can just refuse to take medications, right? So there's psychoeducation, which is you give them, you give them like lifelong treatment. You sit down with them and you explain them everything. There's also borrow-a-frontal, which is when you involve a family member to take care of their finances because patients with bipolar disorder have this like impulsive tendency to like spend a lot, so you can give them or you can have like have them have like a like a companion that actually handles their finances and major decisions. There's also psychotherapies like CBT and social rhythm therapy. When it gets really bad, you can give them a CBT and a family focused therapy. There's also lifestyle changes such as strict sleep routine, so you have to make sure that they're sleeping on time just so the prefrontal cortex starts working, stress management, regular exercising, and also substance avoidance because you want to make sure that nothing triggers it. So that's that. One really important, oops, one sec. One really important thing to keep in mind, sorry, is obesity. Obesity is a major side effect of the medications that are given in the mood disorders, which is why patients don't usually take them and are cranky. Right. So the long-term goals in mood disorders is there's actually no cure, which is really sad. There's no long cure for them. Not 100% cure yet has been discovered. So the aim is usually just giving them like long-term stabilization, mood stabilization, and prevention of like relapses, right? So pharmacotherapy plus psychotherapy and lifestyle change can change everything for the patient, but it cannot really cure it. So you need to make sure that they're not really exposed to substances, they're having a sleep schedule that's good for them, all of that to for them to actually stop getting these not panic attacks, stop getting mood disorders. So yeah, with that, ladies and gentlemen, our lectures are all done and now we're going to be shifting to questions. So if you have any questions throughout the crash course, please feel free to reach out to my number. Now we're just going to be doing questions for mood disorders. Okay, so which clinical feature helps distinguish bipolar 1 disorder from bipolar 2 disorder according to DSM-5 criteria? Okay, I'm going to give you guys 5 seconds and then you can answer. Okay, I think that's good. So the answer here is C, which is presence of at least one full maniac episodes in bipolar 1. Okay? Now, in major depressive disorder, which neurobiological finding has been most consistently associated with the disorder across imaging studies? Okay, this might be a bit tricky, but just read the question really well and you're gonna get the answer. So the answer here is also C, which is decreased activity in prefrontal regions involved in cognitive control. Makes sense because in major depressive disorders, your prefrontal cortex cannot really control your amygdala anymore. Okay, question three is a depressed white 60-year-old widower presents to the psychiatric ward. Which one of the following steps should be taken right away? If you were concentrating, you should know this. The answer here is B, which is assess risk of suicide, because we mentioned that in patients, in elderly patients, in elderly white unmarried patients, risk of suicide is really high. So you need to always assess the risk of suicide. Okay. Amani is a 30-year-old woman who reports feeling anxious with a hard time staying asleep. She also reports symptoms of losing interest in doing things, feeling guilty, unmotivated with low self esteem, and some death wishes. Her symptoms worsened after the birth of her 2-year-old boy. The most likely diagnosis is. Okay, so the answer here is A, which is major depressive disorder. Now, this could be a bit tricky, but keep in mind that postpartum blues happens within weeks. Okay, it happens within weeks, and postpartum depression happens after within like 12 months of the delivery. And she said that the symptoms worsen after her birth of 2-year-old boy. So the birth has already happened 2 years ago. So it can't be both of these because that's not the duration for both of them. So the only thing that's left is major depressive disorder if you match the symptoms. Okay. Hassa is a 27-year-old female who was referred to a psychiatrist by her primary care physician for inadequate response to treatment, mood swings, and had excessive money spending and irritable mood for more than 2 weeks. And she describes periods of time where she had highs. What is the most likely diagnosis? This one's easy. The answer here is bipolar disorder. And with that, our crash course has come to an end, and I hope everything makes clear sense to you guys. Please make sure to scan the QR code and give feedback so I can improve in my further sessions. Also, just one quick note that I wanted to add was I know that Dr. Ali's lectures are really, really long. That's only because he has a lot of cases in his lectures where he discusses all of these diseases in like clinical scenarios or case scenarios for you guys to have better understanding, but I didn't include them. But if you do need to know them, like know the disorders further in detail, I would definitely suggest you guys to read those cases. However, you can always understand the disorders through the crash course, but if you do not, then you can refer back to the cases to get a deeper understanding. But that's pretty much it, and I hope you guys have a great, great Ramadan and a great Eid, and yeah, just stay happy and stay hydrated, and inshallah, good luck for your neuro exam.